It's hard to imagine life without central heating, warm blankets, or hot showers, but in medieval Europe, surviving winter wasn't just about comfort. It was a matter of life and death. The cold months brought brutal snow, biting winds, and frozen rivers that cut off entire villages from the outside world. Yet somehow people endured. And not only endured, they adapted. Through clever architecture, resourceful engineering, and a deep understanding of nature, medieval people built homes that quite literally saved their lives. So, what made these houses so resilient? How did they keep families warm through freezing nights with no electricity, no insulation foam, and no radiators? Let's step back in time and walk through a medieval village, where every log, stone, and thatched roof had a purpose. Imagine it's the year 1320. Snowflakes swirl through the air, settling gently on rooftops as smoke drifts from a dozen chimneys. You push open the wooden gate of a small English village, the sound of your boots crunching in the frost. Ahead, you see homes clustered close together, not spread apart like modern suburbs. That closeness wasn't just for community, it was for warmth. Every house borrowed heat from the next, the same way penguins huddle together in a storm. Medieval builders didn't have thermometers or modern insulation science, but they knew one thing very well: heat is precious, and cold kills. So their houses were built to trap and hold every bit of warmth possible. The typical peasant's home, called a croft or a cruck house, might look simple from the outside. Rough wooden beams, mud-plastered walls, and a thatched roof. But hidden within that simplicity was a masterpiece of survival design. The walls, for example, were made of wattle and daub, a mix of woven wooden sticks and mud blended with straw or animal dung. It may sound crude, but that mix created a surprisingly effective barrier. The mud sealed gaps, keeping out drafts, while the straw gave the walls flexibility to handle moisture and temperature changes. And the thatched roofs. They weren't just for looks. That thick, layered straw was a natural insulator. The air trapped inside each straw stalk formed a cushion, preventing heat from escaping. During heavy snow, the thatch could even absorb some moisture, creating a compacted layer that added even more insulation. So, while the outside world froze, the inside of a peasant's cottage could stay relatively warm, especially near the hearth. Ah yes, the hearth. The heart and soul of every medieval home. Fire was life. It was warmth, food, light, and protection all in one. In smaller homes, there wasn't even a chimney. The fire burned in the center of the single room, and smoke simply escaped through a hole in the roof or a small window. This might sound smoky and unpleasant, and it was. But that rising smoke also coated the roof with a layer of soot that helped waterproof it. Plus, the lingering smoke actually preserved the thatch from insects and rot. Families would gather close around that fire, not just for comfort but for survival. The closer you sat, the more likely you'd make it through the night without frostbite. People even slept on raised platforms near the fire, sometimes with animals like chickens or goats sharing the same room for warmth. The heat from livestock added just enough temperature to keep the interior from freezing solid. Imagine the scene: a family wrapped in wool, huddled together, embers glowing, the faint smell of smoke and stew in the air. Primitive but effective. But medieval architecture varied across Europe, and each region developed its own way of dealing with the cold. In Scandinavia, for instance, winters were far more brutal than in England, so they took insulation to the next level. Houses were often built from massive logs, stacked tightly together, with moss stuffed in the gaps. The thick wood acted like a thermal battery. It absorbed heat from the fire during the day and slowly released it at night. Some Scandinavian homes even had turf roofs, layers of soil and grass piled on top of the roof for extra insulation. They looked like little green hills, but those roofs trapped heat incredibly well. Further south, in France or northern Italy, stone houses became more common. Stone didn't insulate as well as wood, but it retained heat once warmed up. Builders often made the walls thick, sometimes more than 2 feet deep, to store daytime heat from the hearth. In some regions, people even built their homes partially underground, using the earth itself as insulation. You'd walk down a few steps to enter, and though it felt dim inside, it was much warmer than the open air above. The ground acted as a natural blanket, keeping temperatures stable. Every design choice, from the shape of the house to the placement of windows, came down to one goal: preserving heat. Windows were tiny, sometimes just a small opening covered with oiled cloth or animal bladder, which let in light while blocking drafts. Large windows, like we have today, would have been a disaster in winter, sucking out precious warmth. And here's something fascinating: medieval people understood the concept of zoning long before modern architecture did. They used small spaces deliberately. The idea was simple: the less space you had, the easier it was to heat. Big rooms lost heat too quickly, so homes were compact, sometimes with low ceilings to trap warmth near the ground. Even wealthier families who could afford bigger houses designed specific winter rooms. Small chambers lined with tapestries and heavy curtains where they could stay cozy when the cold set in. Tapestries weren't just decoration either. They worked as early insulation. Thick fabric or woven wall hangings created a layer of trapped air between the wall and the room. Just like today's insulation panels. When a draft blew through cracks in the stone, it was softened before reaching anyone inside. Let's not forget clothing. Medieval people didn't rely solely on architecture. They became walking insulation units. Layer upon layer of wool, linen, and fur. Wool was the miracle fabric of the age. It stayed warm even when damp, and everyone from peasants to nobles wore it. Cloaks doubled as blankets, and even shoes were stuffed with straw for extra warmth. Still, winter was harsh, and survival wasn't guaranteed. Many families built communal routines around staying warm. Neighbors shared fires, cooked together, and even slept in the same hall during the coldest nights. The Great Hall of a manor, for example, wasn't just a place for feasts. It was the medieval version of central heating. A massive fire burned in the middle, radiating warmth through the open space. Servants, soldiers, and guests would sleep side by side near the fire, wrapped in cloaks, taking turns feeding the flames through the night. One particularly clever medieval invention was the box bed, common in parts of France and Scotland. Imagine a wooden cabinet big enough to sleep in, with doors that closed shut. Families would crawl inside and shut themselves in like hibernating bears. It was dark, cramped, and probably smelled like smoke, but it was warm. Body heat stayed trapped inside the wooden walls, creating a miniature heated cocoon. In wealthier homes, the evolution of fireplaces brought even more sophistication. By the 14th century, chimneys became more common, allowing for better air control and more efficient heating. Some large stone manors had multiple fireplaces, connected through clever flue systems that distributed heat to upper floors. Think of it as the medieval version of central heating, using nothing but fire and stone. Then there were castles. Those massive cold-looking fortresses that you'd assume were freezing inside. Surprisingly, many were ingeniously designed for warmth. Thick stone walls acted as both insulation and protection. Windows were narrow slits, minimizing heat loss, and castles often had multiple layers of rooms, with inner chambers designed for winter use. Nobles spent much of their winter in these smaller, inner chambers near the kitchens or the great hall fire. Servants kept the fires burning around the clock, using peat, wood, or even dried animal dung when necessary. The kitchens themselves were a key part of the heating system. Unlike today, they weren't just for cooking. They were strategic heat sources. The large ovens and constant activity kept the surrounding rooms warm. Some houses were even built with kitchens at the center, not the back, so the heat could spread through walls to the rest of the home. But what about the poorest of the poor? The beggars, laborers, or traveling monks who didn't have homes. They relied on monasteries and churches, which often opened their doors in winter to shelter travelers. Monasteries, in particular, were masters of heating design. They used hypocaust systems, an ancient Roman technology where hot air flowed under floors or through hollow walls. Monks might have lived simple lives, but their understanding of heat distribution was advanced for the time. The remarkable thing is how all these techniques, mud walls, thatched roofs, low ceilings, central fires, box beds, formed a system that kept people alive without a single watt of electricity. Every solution came from observation, necessity, and generations of experimentation. And even today, those ideas haven't vanished. Modern eco-architecture borrows heavily from medieval wisdom. Passive heating, small windows, natural materials, and earth-sheltered designs all trace back to these ancient methods. Some modern builders in cold climates still use thatch, not just for style but because of its unbeatable insulating power. Think about that for a moment. 800 years ago, without machines or modern science,